Welcome to I'm Not Joking, the podcast where a behavioral scientist examines what it's like to live a humorous life. Glimpse into the lives of the funniest people in entertainment, business, and science as your host, Dr. Peter McGraw, explores their habits, motivations, and secrets to success. Get ready to fire up your brain and your funny bone. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to I'm Not Joking, the podcast that looks at the lives of funny people. I'm Peter McGraw. Today's guest is Steve Stoliar. Steve is the author of Raised Eyebrows, My Years Inside Groucho's House, a bittersweet memoir of the last years in the life of Groucho Marx. He has also written material for Dick Cavett, as well as penning episodes for such television series as Murder, She Wrote, Simon & Simon, the new WKRP in Cincinnati, and Sliders. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Well, I thank you for your patience setting this up. I rescheduled on you like 3 times, and you kept a sense of humor throughout it.
That's what you think. You're actually sitting on an ejector seat.
Lovely. Well, wait 45 minutes before you hit that.
All right.
So, Steve, if you didn't work or weren't working as a writer, what would you be doing?
I've always had an interest in archaeology and paleontology, and I was a history major at UCLA for the first 2 years I was there. I don't think I gave a lot of thought to exactly what I would do, probably teach, but I'm lucky I fell into the entertainment and literary world, because I honestly don't know what else I would do, nor what else I'd be skilled at.
All right, so you were meant to be a writer.
By default.
Okay, well, I like to think that writers have transferable skill sets, no?
I guess. It was never a compulsion. I never thought, as a kid, boy, I'd sure love to write and get up every day and have to write and all that. I don't think of writing that way. It's not something that I absolutely have to do. I have all these stories to tell. I have a lot of emails to send and a lot of angry comments on Facebook, but I honestly, I'm not one of those writers that simply, I'm not disciplined that way, although somehow I have managed to, stagger from project to project and keep my nostrils above the waterline on rent and other frivolities like that.
I see. So that's interesting because this has come up a number of times in recent podcast episodes, this notion that writers write. They get up every day, they write. And you're saying you're a writer, and you've obviously been a successful writer, but that's not your MO.
Right.
How is it that then how do you pull it off then?
I don't know, but somehow I've managed to do it. And I also have done voiceover work, and I've edited other people's work, but there always seems to be something either, literary or entertainment angled about it. I'm not fabulously wealthy, so I don't think it can be said that I've succeeded and now live very comfortably and don't have to worry about,
Well, so I'll put as a point of contrast, I actually just received an email from a friend who's a writer who is thinking of moving to an even cheaper place than he already lives. So thinking about moving to like Montana or Ohio, just because it's become so difficult to make his way as a writer. And he's a good writer too.
It's a very difficult path to navigate in between kidding yourself and throwing in the towel. And there is no right way to do it. There's no magic litmus test. It's very difficult for when people ask my advice. My advice usually starts out with don't take anyone's advice because their circumstances are unique and you can't really transfer that over to, well, I met this writer and he said the thing to do is this. So I don't know. If he has to keep moving to more obscure, cheaper places and still trying to make it as a writer, and it just becomes this point of diminishing returns, this occupational decrescendo, he may have to look at whether or not that's wise, if only from a survival standpoint. But I'm very hesitant to want to take someone's dream and say you're kidding yourself, or give yourself 6 months, and if nothing happens by then, because you never know when something might break. But I salute his stick-to-itness. Indeed.
Yeah, I think, some of this is looking for the right break to take things to the next level. Actually, that's part of the reason. That idea right there is part of what brings me to speak to you. So I'm going to foreshadow that, and we're going to return to it.
Our smarter students will recognize the foreshadowing in Peter's early remarks that come into play at 37 minutes and 12 seconds.
Yes. So you authored Raised Eyebrows, My Years Inside Groucho's House. So you were, correct me if I'm wrong, in Groucho Marx's assistant.
I'll correct you. And you know why I'll correct you? Because I was a secretary. Okay. And there was nothing derogatory or second class about that. And I know that people are called assistants now, the same way that stewardesses have become
flight attendants
yes. And all that stuff. And since I hate, loathe, and despise political correctness, I will stick up for secretary. When someone says assistant, I picture it as someone, in a lab coat, handing Groucho a beaker of phenylphthalein solution or something like that. And I, offhand, although it was years ago, I don't think there were that many times when Groucho said, "Would you hand me a beaker of phenylphthalein solution, Steve?" So I was, in fact, his secretary. I handled the fan mail. I took dictation. I organized his memorabilia for donation to the Smithsonian, and I helped out in those secretarial jobs. So that's the short answer to your question.
Well, we have time, so I want to get into the longer answer, if I may.
Sure.
So how old were you, and how old was Groucho?
I was all of 19, and Groucho was 83, almost 84.
Okay.
When I got the job.
All right. And you had it for how long?
I had it for the last 3 years of his life, from July of 1974 to August of 77.
So you had mentioned being in college. Did you forego college for that time, or you did it while you were a college student?
I did it while I was a college student. As a matter of fact, the way I came into Groucho's world was I and all of my friends, it was a prerequisite for being a friend of mine that they be Marx Brothers fanatics.
I see.
And even though the Marx Brothers only made 13 films, one of them, Animal Crackers, had fallen into obscurity over the years, basically because of an oversight where the copyright wasn't renewed by Paramount, and so the rights reverted back to the people who wrote and composed the book and music for the play Animal Crackers, George S. Kaufman, Maury Riskin, Bert Kalmer, and Harry Ruby. And I started a petition drive on Bruin Walk at UCLA while I was a student there to put pressure on Universal Studios, which had acquired Paramount's pre-1949 library, but didn't feel it was worth spending any money to clear the rights to an old black and white movie. And so it was while I was at UCLA that I was also the head of the committee for the re-release of Animal Crackers, or crack, before it had any narcotic significance. And that is what led directly to my employment.
I see. So Groucho heard about you, found out about you.
There was a woman named Erin Fleming who was a struggling Canadian actress, and she was looking for any kind of work, and there was a producer-writer named Jerry Davis who used to be at MGM and then worked on That Girl and The Odd Couple and a lot of other classy shows, and he had recommended to her that she ask Groucho for a job because he was looking for a temporary secretary. And Jerry thought, well, this will help them both out. What happened, though, was that as more time went by, Aaron became much more in control of Groucho's life personally and professionally, becoming his manager. And really, because he was in his 80s and eventually would suffer strokes and was slowing down, he became more reliant on her for making many, many decisions, big and small, in his life. So she was the one who had heard about the committee and arranged to bring Groucho to Bruin Walk one day. And I said, Groucho, I'm very happy to be meeting you after all this time. And he said, well, you should be. And then Aaron said, this is Steve Stoliar. He's the one who started the committee to get Animal Crackers re-released. And Groucho said, did you get it? And I said, not yet, but we're working on it. And he said, you better or I'll fire you. And I said, I didn't realize I was working for you. How much are you paying me? And he said, a little less than nothing. So that was a remarkable path crossing, because really all I had ever wanted to do was shake his hand and thank him for all the laughs. And I thought that will never happen. He's in his 80s and fading out. I had seen his one-man show in December of 72 at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion from way in the back of the auditorium. And I thought, that is as close as I'm ever going to get to this man. And yet here we were shaking hands and chatting with each other in front of reporters and news people and a throng of hippies and Marx fans and students who kept pushing in to try to hear, because his voice was so kind of thin and papery by then, and they didn't want to miss anything. And we were concerned for his safety, because really there were hundreds of people there. But the film was released, and I had 2 summer jobs that fell through, for which I will forever remain grateful. And my dad was pushing me, get off your fanny. I don't want you lying around the house. Find a job. And I thought I had nothing to lose. So I called Aaron and I said, is there anything at all that you think I might maybe? And she said, well, actually, I used to be Groucho's secretary, but I'm so busy with other business matters. We need someone to handle his fan mail, which has just gotten voluminous in recent years, and also to organize all of his memorabilia, which is going to be donated to the Smithsonian. But it has to be someone who really knows a lot about the Marx Brothers. And in my mind's eye, like a Tex Avery cartoon, she's still on the phone while I'm on the doorstep ringing the bell. I know there was a gap of time there. And of course I wouldn't have known where to go. I thought that I would be working in an office, maybe in an office building on Wilshire Boulevard, handling forwarded fan mail.
Sure.
And maybe I'd get to see him twice a month if he came in to pick stuff up or sign. She says, oh no, dear. You'll be working directly in Groucho's house. There's a room that his last wife used as an artist studio that you could use for your office, and you can make your own hours. And I thought, and they're going to pay me money to do this? And it really was just like my mom used to talk about wanting to just bathe in chocolate sauce, just this indulgent. You can't get enough of it. And in fact, I was like ankle deep in just the most amazing, old Groucho letters and scrapbooks with reviews of their vaudeville and Broadway shows and photos of the brothers out of makeup and scripts with Groucho's handwritten notations, all this stuff. And there was a lot of fan mail coming in, because this was right when the Marx Brothers hit that resurgence in the late 60s and 70s, when the iconoclastic baby boomers embraced the anarchy of the Marx Brothers and W.C. Fields and Mae West. And also they had begun re-syndicating Groucho's TV show, You Bet Your Life. So that was reaching a whole new audience as well. So he really, when I came to work for him, was riding a crest of rediscovery, even though he never officially was retired or forgotten. he didn't have the same sort of problems that, for instance, Stan Laurel or Buster Keaton did, just taking, any job to keep money coming in, and only, a handful of devoted people really keeping in touch with him and saluting him. Groucho, he did in the mid 60s, late 60s, he was doing guest appearances. He would be on the Dick Cavett show. He even did the Hollywood Squares, but he was never really retired. Mm-hmm. And then came this wave of recognition. And I was delighted to be part of that. Part of that was Animal Crackers playing in theaters in 35 millimeter for the first time in decades. And, I think it broke the house record at the UA Westwood that had been set by the French Connection. So that was personally gratifying, because I knew there would be people that wanted to see this more than just my friends.
Mm-hmm. So within a week, I'm speaking to someone who is a huge Groucho Marx fan. So previously I talked to Mike Reis, who's a writer for The Simpsons.
Oh, yeah.
And Mike...
R-E-I-S, right?
R-E-I-S-S.
Yes, yeah. But
and he adores the Marx Brothers, and talked about having watched Duck Soup more than 50 times in his life. And he had an interesting line, if I remember correctly. He argued that that Groucho is the best verbal humorist ever, and was paired with Harpo, the best nonverbal humorist ever. Or among the best. I can't.
Hey, what about Zeppo?
And then he said Zeppo just helped hold things together.
I guess, yeah. And Chico, of course. Well, I wouldn't wrestle him to the ground saying that's preposterous. Groucho, in addition to being verbally skilled, Groucho's facial expressions, plus he was quite lithe and if you watch him dancing, Hooray for Captain Spaulding, and the way he walked and the wiggling eyebrows and all that, there was a physicality to him that was more than just the lines. I'm sure, Chaplin and Keaton fans might argue with the Harpo thing, but given the fact that they were brothers, that is a pretty rare, completely capricious happenstance.
And my guess is that probably each of them made the other one better as a result of that contrast.
I think so. And I think even, as much guff as Zeppo gets for not adding a lot, when he was subtracted, and then you tended to see like Kenny Baker or John Carroll or, some of the bland leading men there, you wished that Zeppo were still among them, because there was a certain kindred spirit. I mean, they had been through so much together, from vaudeville and Broadway. And there is the cliche, which was true from my own experience, that Zeppo had a great charisma and was very, very funny off camera.
I've heard that. I've read that.
It's true. Yeah. I mean, I witnessed it. I was the brunt of it to some degree.
He teased you?
Yeah. I was going with a young lady at the time, and Zeppo was coming up from Palm Springs, and Aaron asked if I wanted to stay to dinner and meet him. And I said I would, but I have a date. And Aaron said, bring her. And I thought, oh, I like that. Because this is the young lady I was dating was very self-possessed and unflappable. And I thought, this'll flap her. So I picked her up, and she said, where are we going? And as I start to snake my way up Hillcrest Road in Beverly Hills, I said, a little out of the way place. And she said, oh, I know where we're going. I don't want to do this. And then I thought, too bad. I'm putting you through this. And it ended up being a delightful evening. And Zeppo, big surprise, took a liking to her.
Okay.
She was 19, very bright, blonde hair, blue eyes. He was flirtatious. He said, Steve, you and Linda should visit me in Palm Springs sometime. And I said, I don't know. I was there when I was about 8, and it was just sweltering. And he said, well, when were you there? In the summer? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, Steve, it's cold in Alaska during the winter, too. And she and I eventually broke up, and I wrote him a letter figuring he'd been around the block a few times with relationships, asking for advice for the lovelorn. I get a phone call from Palms. Steve, it's Zeppo Marx. I got your letter. I hope I'm not stepping on your toes, but do you think Linda would go out with me? And I thought, this is really weird. I asked him for help, and he's hitting on her. And I thought, well, I mean, she got a kick out of him. And I mean, she was 19 and he was 74.
Okay, yeah.
And I said, well, all I can say is I'll ask her. And he said, really, I would never want to do anything that would upset you. You understand that. And so if this is at all awkward, no, that's a bit. So I asked her, and she kind of thought it would be a kick. And they went out once. He took her to dinner in San Diego and then a high-ally game in Tijuana.
Oh, wow. That's
which
an
I guess that's
date for a 50-plus year age difference.
Well, I mean, he wasn't playing high-ally.
Yes.
They were merely, I guess that was Zeppo's first date. We go to dinner in San Diego, then a high-ally game. But I saw him after that, and he said, I want to tell you, Steve, I didn't even kiss her goodnight. Yeah, you need to know that. I had a lovely time, but all she did was talk about herself. And then I saw her on campus, and she said, Zeppo was really nice, but all he did was talk about himself. Yeah, and I think we're probably both right. But after that, when I'd be at a party and Zeppo would be up from Palm Springs, he would introduce me to someone and say, this is Steve. He and I dated the same girl, but he got further with her than I did.
Okay, that's funny.
So
I want to step back for a second. I know I was foreshadowing, but I want to step back. So Groucho is
not going to have to backshadow for a while.
Is such a iconic figure, right? So I brought a copy of the Humor Code, and on the copy of the book sitting right across from me is a planet with the well-known Groucho eyebrows, glasses, nose, mustache. So this is few people in comedy have that iconic signature. This is equal to the Michael Jordan,
right?
Leg spread dunking the
Michael
ball for Nike.
Michael Jackson sequined white glove.
Exactly, right? So this is, but however, right? So even though that's familiar,
yes,
there are likely to be listeners who only vaguely know about Groucho and the Marx Brothers. And so if you would indulge me with a brief history lesson, kind of rise of this comedy troupe.
Okay. Remind me that that's your question.
Okay.
In case I forget. But I first wanted to say that as I get older, and I am apparently getting older, it's interesting. In one sense, there are fewer people who can place the name Groucho and the Marx Brothers, because you get past Generation X and then into the millennials, and there's just so much content for them to see, to stay up, to podcasts and everything else.
Also, if I may,
yeah.
Some comedy generally doesn't travel as well,
right,
as drama does. So, people still read Shakespeare, and
right,
Casablanca
classics
holds up pretty well as a movie.
Right.
The even elite comedy, often can struggle.
Right. And but the flip side of the few, people that I have to explain who they were is that I will often hear from people saying, I ran monkey business and my granddaughter who's 4 laughed at Harpo.
Mm-hmm.
Or my son who's 10 thought Groucho was very funny. Or I showed it in my class and it went over well. And that, when I was working at Groucho's, I would meet all of his contemporaries, the people who wrote and directed his films, fellow humorists and writers. And to them, I was this young whippersnapper, mm-hmm. this kid, and it was gratifying to them that someone at that late date knew all about who Nat Perrin or Irving Brecker or S.J. Perelman or Maury Riskind were. now that I'm in my 60s, I find myself, having the cockles of my heart warmed by hearing that some of these kids today still appreciate the Marx Brothers. But unfortunately, a negative force working against it is the horrid plague of political correctness. That is really, I'll have people say, the way Groucho treated those women on You Bet Your Life is so sexist. It's like they feel like he should have been ashamed of himself in retrospect, because 60 years later, it would fall out of fashion to be flirtatious, or for an older man to be flirtatious with a younger woman after the whole Me Too thing. And that somehow it's a retroactive political correctness that gets me more het up than regular political correctness, because that's the kind of thing. I mean, there was that Lillian Gish auditorium at that college, and they renamed it because she was in Birth of a Nation, which glorifies the Klan, and that's just not something they want to be associated with. And there's just such a low tolerance for things. And of course, as you were talking about the timeliness of comedies versus timelessness of classics, there's lines in Marx Brothers films that, cause people to gasp. Groucho says the Headstrongs married the Armstrongs, and that's why darkies were born. Well, there was a song called That's Why Darkies Were Born that was very popular. It doesn't mean that Groucho was a racist or thought that black people were second-class citizens. As a matter of fact, he was, for a man born in 1890, remarkably progressive and liberal, given the fact that he was literally a Victorian. Mm. And, there's lots of pictures of him with his arm around Nat King Cole and extolling the virtues of Sammy Davis and civil rights and all this stuff.
I see.
But now there's such a zero tolerance that you get that, or some of the musical numbers with Harpo from Day at the Races and at the circus, where all these happy dancing black people are behind him, like following, the Pied Piper or something like that. And there's no sense of historical perspective. There's only reflexive condemnation.
I see. So this actually anticipates a question that I was going to ask.
It foreshadows it.
I was going to ask you, how do you think Groucho...
And I knew I'd forget what your question was. We'll get back to that.
The answer to that question will be even sweeter, having set up all this. How do you think Groucho would react to in today's kind of outrage culture? Like,
I think he would find it ridiculous, because Groucho was a reasonable, fair-minded person who could see both sides of almost any argument. I think he was a very fair evaluator of people who he disagreed with. He still respected. I mean, there's a wonderful firing line with Groucho and William F. Buckley, who were diametrically opposed politically, but he admired Buckley. Mm-hmm. And they have a very intelligent, not going for the laughs conversation. It's available. It might be on YouTube, but it's available, on DVD.
If I find it, I'll put it in the exhibits. Yeah.
And it's interesting because it's a sort of agreeing to disagree conversation between two very intelligent people who respect each other. Maury Riskind, who co-wrote Coconuts, Animal Crackers, Night at the Opera, adapted Room Service, and was, a close friend of Groucho in the early years and for the rest of his life, took a real sharp right turn and became just a super conservative Republican, writing for the Herald Examiner and just decrying everything about the people who were protesting the Vietnam War and all this. I mean, he was really, like a Goldwater Republican. And Groucho didn't cut off from him. He didn't say he's not welcome here anymore. They just would either steer clear of politics or just have sort of a pleasant disagreement and then go on to something else. Mm. But Groucho was big enough to say, I like this man a lot. We're longtime friends. That's not a deal breaker that he's super red Republican and I'm a super blue Democrat. And Groucho also didn't have much tolerance for the intellectualism. I mean, for instance, I sort of bristle on his behalf since he isn't around anymore when people talk about Duck Soup as a satire on the futility of war. They may see it as that, but anyone who tries to give credit to any of the writers, the director, or any of the four Marx Brothers for setting out to make a satire on the futility of war is flat out wrong. It's not a matter of opinion. And they were interviewed over the years, and to a man, they said, we were not making statements on war. It had nothing to do with, Hitler being elected that year and war, trying to have a message or something. We were just trying to be funny. Mm-hmm. And if you think, well, in Coconuts, Groucho was the manager of a hotel, and in Horse Feathers, he's the head of a college. What would be the next logical? Well, how about making him the head of a mythical country? Mm-hmm. That would give him even more raw material. And the year before, Paramount had done $1 Million Legs with W.C. Fields, where he was the president of Klopstokia, another one of those, mythical European places. So people see things in the films that were not intended, and it's an actual mistake to try to credit them with intentionally satirizing the futility of war and sending a message. They were just trying to find what setting would lend itself to funny stuff with the Marx Brothers, and making him the head of a country would be the ultimate example of that. So he wouldn't get angry about it, but he would just kind of, cluck his tongue and shake his head and say, we were just trying to be funny.
I see.
And that's what the writer said. And that's what Leo McCarey said when Joe Adamson interviewed him for Groucho, Harpo, Chico, and sometimes Zeppo, wonderful book. It is a mistake to ascribe these. You'll read about King Kong, and they'll say that the sliding of the big log through the gate it's sexual. It's meant to represent Kong's virility and all this. And it's like, no, it kept Kong on the other side of the wall, you see. Or can I give you another anecdote that isn't Marx related?
Sure.
It's another good example of.
If I understand what you're saying is, while in literature and film and music and so on, some people do have, they want to satirize, they want to have these, allusions, they want to reference other things. But sometimes a cigar is just a cigar.
Yep, exactly.
Yes.
John Ford had appeared at UCLA a year or two before I was there. They had a screening of The Searchers for students, and then a Q&A afterwards. And I wasn't there then, but my teacher told me that Ford was sitting in a chair, and they were taking questions from the students, and one kid raised his hand and said, Mr. Ford, I notice in a lot of your films you use a lot of fences, and I was wondering if the fences were meant to represent how man borders himself, separates himself from his fellow man or from nature. What is it that the fences are meant to signify, and why you use them in your films? And Ford leaned into the microphone and said, son, I make a lot of Westerns, and out west there's a lot of ranches, and if you don't have fences, the cows walk away.
Right. Yeah, I think that this is an interesting, certainly, critics and academics and so on are very good at reading deeply into things, even when they don't need to.
Right.
I actually just, it was given to me a clip. It was a filmmaker who basically dissected a scene out of the movie that he made, Shazam, and just explained how so much of filmmaking is just problem solving. And you mean
and just impromptu, like it was raining that day, so we shot it indoors.
It could be that, or
yeah.
In his case, and I'll put this in the exhibits. In his case, he basically explained, well, like there's sort of a peculiar set of behaviors that the characters engaged in, which is they put their jackets on, they came out onto the porch, then they were told to go back inside, kind of this kind of thing. And It's like, it would have just made more sense to just put them in the window and have them in the window during the scene. And he's like, well, the reason that this happened is the wardrobe person said, listen, the kids are now going to be in these subsequent set of scenes in winter, and they're going to be in their jackets. Mm-hmm. And so if you can have them in their jackets now, it just creates continuity later.
Right.
And he's like, shit, okay, how do we do this? And so you make in this case, he makes a sort of what seems like a peculiar set of directorial decisions, because he's just trying to solve this problem. How do I get these kids in their coats? And how is it that they don't take them off when they go back into the place? And, he's relying on a little bit of change blindness in the audience.
If they're focusing on continuity errors, they're not caught up in the plot and the characters.
Indeed. And most people get caught up in the plot and the characters. They're transported by narrative. So this idea is like, these people are on a ranch, and so there's going to be fences, and this is how we know they're on a ranch versus out in the middle of, the middle of the American West. I think that's great. So, this idea of dealing with kind of outrage culture, political correctness, the fact that it's easier now than ever for people to have opinions and express them broadly, via Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and beyond, I think is interesting for comedy. There's a lot of comics, especially middle-aged comics, who complain about it. I don't do colleges anymore, and so on. I have to say,
what would happen if Don Rickles were starting now? He wouldn't get booked.
So I think this is an interesting thing. First of all, the comics who say, I'm not doing colleges anymore, for the most part, are comics who've made their money. So they don't need to do colleges anymore.
Seinfeld.
Indeed. Yeah.
Seinfeld will
Chris
probably
Rock
be okay.
And so on. Yeah, exactly. Because Seinfeld made $69 million last year. Right?
Carefully budgeted, you can get by on that.
Yes, indeed. So here's my belief is that the best comics adapt. They change based upon the culture. That is, they're good at seeking out the right audience for them. And so, first of all, I think that Don Rickles would be fine. And the reason why I think Don Rickles would be fine is because Anthony Jeselnik is fine. That is, that you can be a comic like Anthony Jeselnik and not hold back at all.
Right. Ricky Gervais.
And you can find an audience who welcomes it. The other one is that what you do is so there was a time where comics, people like George Carlin and Richard Pryor, went bluer.
Right.
They turned up the volume on the outrage.
They started out wearing a suit with short hair and ended up with either the frizzy afro of Pryor or the long hair and beard of Carlin and a lot of four-letter words.
Exactly. They adapted. Well, you can adapt in the other direction if you need to.
I have to think about that because that starts to make me uneasy because it starts to sound like if you're going to entertain at colleges, you better know that if you use this phrase or if you try to go this route, you're going to get hissed or booed because you've trespassed on something that is now taboo, and you should think of a different joke or a different way to go unless you don't mind pissing off the audience. And that doesn't sound like it goes in reverse the same way it goes forward with blue material.
I don't know why there's an asymmetry there. I mean, I guess my thing is look, you can be an artist or you can do commerce. And so if you expect people to pay for your shows, then the audience does have a say. And so in that way, recognizing
it is show business. It isn't just sitting in your velvet smock and painting an abstract in the attic that no one is ever going to see, or writing poems in a diary and only you have the key to it. You are doing something intended to make money, and if you only alienate people, then what have you accomplished?
That's the point. Which is, and I also think the other one is that I think that idea of I'm not going to do college campuses anymore sells the comic short in their ability to tackle tough topics.
But I think It makes me want to take the students by the hand, by the shoulders, and shake them and say, listen and think and understand context, and stop being like a knee that gets hit with a rubber hammer and you shut down at the first mention of this thing, especially because college is supposed to expose you to think, that it's like the First Amendment. It protects safe speech, but it doesn't need it. It needs people to, it's I would fight to the death for your right to express it,
I think that's fair. I'll make a counterpoint. And, as someone I spend time on college campuses, and so I see this. The issue is that withdrawing and saying I'm out doesn't help. In the idea is that if the comics, let's be honest, comics, their first goal was to get the laughs. Their second goal is to change people's mind. Right? So if you give them a choice between the laughs and the changing your mind, they're going to take the laughs 99% of the time. So to pull yourself out of that then forgoes both the laughs and the ability to change minds.
I agree.
And so if you are worried about the youth of the nation, the youth of the world, and their fragilities and sensitivities, and the fact that they're well-meaning but snow-plowing parents are actually setting them up for failure, then the question becomes, can you use your superior communication,
to bridge the gap,
comedic abilities to find a gentle way to start to make this happen? So that's what I
don't know. I mean, it's a rhetorical question.
And the issue is this, you know what? I think that you can. And you know who's going to do it? Not the 50-year-old comics, not the 60-year-old comics. It's going to be the 20 and 30-year-old comics. And that's just the nature of, I think, art, and so the Chris Rocks have the luxury of being like, I'm out, but if you're 25 and you're trying to get 10 years of comic experience to become great, boy, that's a great, if you can navigate those crowds, you can navigate any crowd.
Yeah.
So that's my counterpoint as someone who, again, I have the great luxury of not having to make people laugh. Clearly,
and you've certainly succeeded.
I'm very good at that. So let's get back to the primer. I want you to give a primer on the Marx Brothers, their rise from vaudeville to to creating, among some people say Duck Soup is the best comedy film ever made.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that.
I always try to avoid those. What are the 100 funniest or best or worst? Because it's all.
Yeah, I agree.
Anyway.
But nonetheless,
it's
there's
highly
consensus that this is a top comedy film.
Right, and they're best.
Yes.
The Marx Brothers were born in New York in the late 1800s. Zeppo, the youngest, was born in 1901, so he just made it to the 20th century. And they began as singers and eventually started throwing comedy material in, and this was in vaudeville in the very early 1900s, and they would tour the country playing every manner of live theaters that had vaudeville, and they would be on the bill with acrobats and trained dogs
and so vaudeville being both a place and a type of entertainment.
Right. It wasn't a Broadway show. It was like a variety show, assuming anyone knows what variety shows still are, where you would have a comedian and then a singer and a tap dancer and an animal act. You would pay your money and get an evening's worth of entertainment. And generally speaking, the star attraction was second to last on the bill. That was considered the most prestigious spot.
Why penultimate?
I don't know. Well, certainly the first couple of acts, people are still taking their seats. Indeed, so you fritter it away. And maybe it's just like, and now here's what you've all been waiting for. And then too bad for the person that follows.
Yeah,
them.
It seems, that's interesting.
But that was, it was generally considered second to last was the ultimate billing in vaudeville.
Interesting.
So by the time they got into comedy, they still weren't doing shows with a beginning, middle, and end. They were doing sketches, humorous sketches, like that would take place in a classroom or something like that. And Harpo, named because that was his instrument of choice, would get a solo, and Chico, because he chased chicks, had an Italian accent, obviously not natural since they were Jewish kids from the Upper East Side. He would play the piano. I don't think it was a decision on Harpo's part not to speak. I think he was nervous, and he didn't have a very good knack for remembering lines and delivering them convincingly. So his verbal participation gradually decrescendoed to the point where he said nothing but acted with his body and noises like honking a horn or whistling, and was a pantomime artist and harpist, a quite accomplished harpist, self-taught on the wrong shoulder because he was looking at photos that were reversed.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. But, he played better on the wrong shoulder than most did correctly. So, and then in the early 20s, they started having more sophisticated material that was enough to build an actual Broadway show around. The first was I'll Say She Is, which still didn't really have much of a plot, but at least was a prestigious Broadway show rather than the knockabout, having to avoid donkeys and magicians backstage. At least it was a Broadway show. And then they really hit their stride with The Coconuts in 1925, which was written by George S. Kaufman, who was just the most successful playwright at the time. I would compare him to Neil Simon, except I wonder how many people know who Neil Simon is now. Having Kaufman write the material really elevated their prestige, and The Coconuts was a huge hit, followed by Animal Crackers on Broadway, and then Paramount signed them up to do movies. The first two were shot in New York on Long Island, and in fact, they were shooting the film version of Coconuts during the day, and at night would go back into Manhattan to make up for their live performance in Animal Crackers. Mm-hmm. So they were performing two different shows, one for the camera and one for live audiences.
Yeah, I want to interrupt with a couple questions real quick. So, one thing that's sort of striking about the rise of the Marx Brothers is that it feels familiar in the same way that you find stand-up comics in particular, maybe improvisers, but mostly you think of stand-ups as kind of taking a bigger stage, moving, to sort of more accessible mediums. So, Steve Martin at one point being the world's biggest stand-up, then getting into TV and film, and then branching out, in not only in just performing, but other roles, writing, directing, producing, etc., kind of thing.
Because you earn the clout to call the shots.
Yeah.
Instead of being at the mercy of a producer or something like that.
Yeah. And so the Marx Brothers seem like one of the first, if not the first, to really do that. To move from vaudeville to Broadway to.
I'd have to think of, there were contemporaries like Eddie Cantor. Eddie Cantor is another misconception that the record was set straight in a film class at UCLA, that the biggest, most popular moneymakers in early sound comedy were not the Marx Brothers, Mae West, and W.C. Fields. It was Eddie Cantor, Joe E. Brown, and Will Rogers, who today probably have 17 fans combined.
Yeah. So why the change? Why, because I know I'm super interested in Mae West also as a.
Got to meet her at Groucho's too.
No, that must have been neat.
Oh my, yes.
Yeah. What a fascinating woman.
And 4'11" in her stocking feet.
Is that right?
Yep.
I didn't know that.
Yep.
Oh, well, in any case, I think it's
so tastes change.
Yeah.
The people who were white hot in 1930, 31, 32, it didn't travel well. If you watch Eddie Cantor musical comedies now, They're pleasant. You can see why he would be a popular and likable entertainer, but nobody just can't catch their breath because of Eddie Cantor's rapid fire stuff or the zany antics of Joe E. Brown. Most people now, if they can place the name Joe E. Brown, remember him as Osgood, the older millionaire in Some Like It Hot.
Oh, yes.
That falls for Jack Lemmon in drag.
Yeah, that's right.
But he was super, super popular decades earlier.
Interesting.
But had, it just, there aren't Joey Brown fans. Will Rogers has a place as a revered and beloved humorist because of the witty things that he said that are still true about politics in Washington and that sort of thing. But watching a feature-length Will Rogers film asks a bit of the audience.
I see.
Which, and it isn't the movie's fault. Nobody in 1930 thought, I wonder if 90 years from now this will still hold up. It's only a fluke and a credit to the people whose material still makes people laugh now, even if there are, the occasional trespasses into what's no longer politically acceptable. But still, in general, people will enjoy the Marx Brothers, the Three Stooges, Abbott and Costello.
Yeah, sure. I mean, some of it is the physicality of it all. I think,
right.
That's, to me, physical comedy.
Drawing a saw across someone's head will always be funny unless it's in real life.
Indeed, yes. So the second thing I wanted to ask about was something that I read because they were doing theater and then they were turning these theater shows into movies, but they tested out lots of jokes. They knew what worked, what didn't work, and it helped enhance the funniness of the movies. Well, unlike most comedies today, you film these scenes, you think they're funny, but you don't know how funny they are until you test screen it.
Right.
And then if you don't have enough funny scenes, you have to rush and scramble to do reshoots.
There's also, one of the problems with the Marx Brothers. Well, all right, let me lay this out.
So is that right that, they have that advantage?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Coconuts and Animal Crackers were Broadway smashes that then traveled across the country in the roadshow. So they knew what worked and they knew the stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But when they went to Hollywood in 1931 after making the film versions of Coconuts and Animal Crackers, the next three films they made, Monkey Business, Horse Feathers, and Duck Soup, are, I think, the golden trinity, the high point, the purest, funniest stuff they ever did.
Okay.
Unfortunately, audiences in the early 1930s missed a lot of the dialogue and the gags because they were laughing so hard.
Oh, interesting.
The pace is much quicker than in Coconuts and Animal Crackers. And also part of it was that the boom microphone opened them up. In early sound films in the late 1920s, they had to have the mic somewhere near where the actors were. So they couldn't really move that much or the sound wouldn't pick them up. And then in Hollywood, they had the boom microphone that could follow them around. And with Monkey Business, it was just like the Marx Brothers had been shot out of a cannon compared to Coconuts and Animal Crackers. Then when Duck Soup, it didn't perform that well at the box office, so Paramount didn't pick up their option. And they were toying with going back to Broadway, where they were fully appreciated and big hits, and people didn't bug them about the things that studios would. Irving Thalberg, who was running MGM in the 1930s, was playing bridge with Chico, and he said, I could make a movie with you and your brothers that would have half as many laughs and make twice as much money.
Oh, that's interesting.
And that begat Night at the Opera and the great controversy amongst Marx Brothers fans, because I think that the average fan of classic cinema, which does not mean before Star Wars, it means silent comedy, 30s, 40s, maybe into the 50s, they would think that A Night at the Opera is the Marx Brothers' best film.
Okay.
And it may be their best film in terms of production values and pacing and quality. But in terms of laughs, Thalberg was right. It had half as many laughs, and that and Day at the Races were their biggest money makers. But the purists, and I consider myself one of those, see going to MGM as the beginning of the end for the Marx Brothers, as opposed to hitting the big time, because MGM was so prestigious. And Groucho said it meant the world to them to go to MGM, which was a bigger deal than Paramount, because there you were with Clark Gable and Greta Garbo and Jean Harlow, and you'll have to Google all these names.
Yeah. And this is a time where actors had a contract with the studio.
The studio,
yes.
Right. And so the other thing that Irving Thalberg did was he said, because so many laughs got laughed over in your Paramount films, let's take some of the scenes on the road and try them out live.
Okay.
And they did that with Night at the Opera and Day at the Races, and they had the writers sitting in the audience taking notes. This got a big laugh, this didn't go over well, and then they would revise the dialogue. And they were able to leave room for the laughs, such that if you pop the DVD of Night at the Opera in and watch it by yourself, it seems slow, because there are moments when, like, Chico and Groucho are looking at each other after saying something, and it isn't because they forgot the next line. It's because they're letting room for the laugh there.
For an audience in a theater. Not
if you see it in a theater now with an audience that, appreciates the material, it works. It still works. But unlike the Paramount films don't really require the communal experience.
Yes.
So it was a give and take when they went to MGM.
I see. That's super fascinating. So that's somewhat consistent with my understanding about this. So yeah, that's really, really neat. So we're almost out of time.
Okay.
But I would say I want to chat about you a little bit more in a moment, but I is in terms of this sort of primer, so they do their 13 films.
There's so much to say. Yes.
Know. Well, people can read your book.
They do that. Yes. I wouldn't stop them from reading the book. Available in 3 floor mats. It's available on Amazon. You can get either the paperback or Kindle or the audiobook with me doing all of the voices, which I'm used to doing just from telling people that, George Burns would come over and say, okay, let's eat. You want to live to be an old man, become an actor. Hi, Groucho, how are you? I remember when you and Gracie were. So I'm used to slipping in and out of the voice. So anyway.
I wanted to actually ask you about that. That was something that I was going to come up. So how about sneeze? We actually talked about moments like
You'll
this.
want to leave that sneeze.
We're leaving that in.
Yeah, that's the best part. Very convincing, by the way.
So you said you've done voiceover work, and very clearly you do voices.
Thank you.
Where'd you get that?
No idea.
Okay.
People ask me, how can you suddenly sound like Raymond Burr while you're talking? Tokyo is in ruins as Godzilla. And the best I can come up with is, how do you know how to shape your lips to whistle a specific note? I don't know. I just have had a flair for it since I was a kid, and would get in trouble for making fun of teachers and rabbis and so forth.
Okay. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I've enjoyed it. So you did the audiobook. Now so I'm working on a new book, and I asked about reading it, doing it for Audible, and the folks I'm working with very politely but sternly said, don't. And they essentially said, get a pro. It's incredibly difficult. And of course, pros make it look easy.
Right.
It's very difficult, and it'll be better for your listeners and better for you.
It's on a case-by-case basis.
Okay.
If you have a flair for that and you tell it well and you can enunciate and you don't mind. I mean, it took many hours in a sweat box. It was really, the circumstances weren't the greatest, although it came out very nicely, and I'm very pleased with it. I cannot imagine anyone else doing it.
I mean, for you, it seems perfect.
See, if you see, I mean, you must have seen, especially local commercials, where you can tell the owner of the store said, no one can put this across the way I can.
Right.
And they say, we have every kind of jacket that you could ever look for because you, the customer, are important to us. And they think, yeah, that's what I want. And you don't. You want someone, you, the customer, are important to us. And that's why we want you to. So there is no blanket rule about that. But you need to understand you are getting into a heavy-duty recording. We had to take breaks for oxygen and Diet Coke because it was so hot and he had to turn the air conditioner off because you got the ambient in the background. So I can't advise you, but as far as someone just saying, no, don't do it, leave it to the professionals, I wouldn't accept that as definitive.
That's fair.
Nor would I say, no one could do this the way I can. Because if you end up like the clothing salesman, then it's like, they should have gotten someone that can do this.
Yeah, I see. But clearly you have more skills than I have.
I don't know.
I think it's fair to say. I don't mind saying when I'm outclassed.
Aw.
Let's talk a little bit about, so you've also, besides writing, you've also worked on documentaries.
Yes.
So, John Lennon, Elvis Presley, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Shemp Howard.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I got to interview Shemp's
so
granddaughter.
Again, I think people know John Lennon, Elvis Presley.
We don't know who Martin Luther King is, but believe me, they know who Shemp is. And that's what's wrong with America, ladies and gentlemen.
So who is Shemp?
Shemp was one of the original Three Stooges, even though people think of him as a replacement stooge, because the original Three Stooges were Moe, Larry, and Shemp. And then Shemp went off on his own, and Curly was brought in, and those tend to be the classic, Curly being the fat, funny guy, and Moe being the boss that abuses the others, and Larry being the stooge with the frizzy hair, who also played the violin. Then in the 40s, Curly had a stroke, and so Shemp was brought in to be the third stooge.
Brought back in.
Yeah, brought back in for the short films they were making at Columbia, and they cranked out a lot of them. That's another reason why, to me, unfortunately, the Three Stooges tend to be better known than the Marx Brothers, is because there's so much more material.
Yeah, that's right.
As opposed to 13 movies and, some rare TV appearances and Groucho's quiz show in the 50s. But you can't, and the same thing with Laurel and Hardy, who I love, but they made silent films. They made sound shorts. They made sound features. So there's a whole lot of stuff that they made from the late 20s to the early 50s consistently.
I think what happens is I can tell you this, I'm much more familiar with the Three Stooges, and the reason is I was a kid in the 70s and 80s.
Right.
And when you got sick and you stayed home, there were only 6 stations. Right, three VHS or VHF,
and the educational stand,
and you could see, or on weekends, you could see a lot of Three Stooges in syndication.
Well, television was a huge boost to the Three Stooges' popularity. I mean, they had only just stopped making shorts when they started syndicating the stuff on television, and that led to a whole new. Because, those weren't made for children. Those were, short films were part of going to see a movie, and you would see the feature, and then they would have a newsreel because there wasn't television, and it would show you things that happened in the news, within the past week or so, politically, sports, fashion, entertainment, and there might be a cartoon and maybe a Three Stooges short, but it was not just a kiddie thing. But the kids really embraced them in the 50s and early 60s. And in fact, the Three Stooges were the first celebrities I ever saw in person, because I was a kid in St. Louis. We lived there till I was 7. And the Three Stooges were promoting one of their, it wasn't Have Rocket Will Travel, but it was one of those late 50s, early 60s things with Curly Joe taking over for Curly, the original Curly, and they were appearing somewhere, and I got to see them, which was really exciting. But I couldn't understand why they looked so much older in person than they did on my television set. Because, of course, I'm watching films from the early 30s and looking at them and saying, well, the Curly doesn't look right. He doesn't look the same.
Yes.
And then Larry had what he had left of his hair slicked back. And I remember Mo saying, and this is Larry. He combs his hair with an egg beater. And I thought, even at 7, I thought, that joke doesn't work. Because combing your hair with an egg beater only works with the frizzy-haired Larry.
Right.
Now, anyway, this is the kind of child I was.
So let me ask you 2 more questions.
Yep.
And then I will free you. This maybe sound like a strange question, but
I'll give a strange answer.
was Groucho a good businessman?
I'm not sure. He lost his first fortune in the stock market crash of 29.
Mm-hmm. But didn't everybody?
I was going to say that is not unique to him.
Yeah.
He took the advice of Eddie Cantor and invested in Goldman Sachs. And the day that the stock market crashed, they were still doing Animal Crackers on Broadway. And, Groucho was really thrown by that. He said his manager, his business guy, his stockbroker, called him up and said, Marx, the jig is up. That was how he phrased it to him. And that night when he came out, there was a moment in the show where Groucho just turned to the audience and said, don't ever get financial advice from Eddie Cantor. I mean, it meant nothing to anyone there, but he just had to get that out.
I see.
So he spent the rest of his life more frugally.
Okay.
I think because once to think about the hard Scrabble years of vaudeville and, sleeping in bunk beds
and traveling
and
by
all that
train
stuff and horrible stuff and being mistreated and people throwing stuff at the stage and all that and making it to Broadway and being big Broadway stars and about to make your first movie. And they had moved from their, apartment kind of living to having big expensive houses in Great Neck, Long Island, where all the famous literati had their estates there and bought big cars and it was like, we've made it. And then bang, it's all gone. And that must have been terrifying.
Yes.
So once Groucho came to California, he was more frugal. And, I think he stayed with the same investment broker for decades, a guy named Salwin Shufro, very strange name, but he pops up in the Groucho letters, the book of letters to and from Groucho. So they were friends in addition to just being client. And then when Aaron Fleming came in, she started causing Groucho to spend his money more freely, redecorating the house and buying more luxurious things that he really didn't give a shit about, but wanted to please her. So, but I think Chico was considered, well, this is an interesting, then on the other hand, situation. Chico was the more shrewd businessman and was great with numbers, just like an idiot savant with numbers in his head. But he was a compulsive gambler. And so, he would throw away good cards in a card game to make it more exciting. Or he would bet $100 which of 2 raindrops would reach the bottom of a taxi window first. So even though he was great with money, he was horrible with money. And was always broke. The whole cliche, and it always pops up on Gilbert Gottfried's podcast, Chico needed the money. It was true. Chico always needed the money. And his brothers were always bailing him out. But he probably had the best business sense. If only he had used it for good instead of evil.
Or for fun at the very least.
Yeah.
So last question. Tell me one thing you're reading, watching, or listening to that's great. That's really, really good. Not just run-of-the-mill good, but you think's outstanding.
Are you saying
your own
something
consumption
now?
Yeah, something that you've been reading, that you watch, you listen to, that you're really enjoying.
A thunderous silence. That doesn't mean that there isn't anything. I'm just trying. You sort of sideswipe me with that. Wow. I'm trying to think of the last movie that had me going so I couldn't catch my breath. Certainly Borat.
Okay.
it isn't that often. A lot of people think I'm not enjoying something because I'm not laughing. But the truth is, I'll get it and I'll appreciate it and I'll enjoy it, but it takes an extra thing. Sometimes I'll smile loudly.
Mm-hmm.
But I know there have been I know I'm shortchanging.
That's fine.
Someone.
I just needed one. So Boris
all right.
is a good answer.
That's reasonable. Was that for this millennium at least?
Hey, look, it doesn't, I mean, when I talked to Mike Reese.
And when I did Gilbert Gottfried's podcast the first time, I was in purple-faced, sweat-dripping hysterics.
I see.
We played very well off each other we didn't know we'd get along well. He just thought I was on to talk about my book. And then we sort of took off the gloves and got in the mud pit of being, 9 years old and just had a blast. And I told my sister I want her to play that at my funeral.
That's fantastic. And I think that's probably the best place then with that idea
my funeral?
of your of playing that podcast at your funeral rather than this one. That said, this has been a great pleasure and super interesting as I
hope
expected.
so.
I really appreciate your time.
It was my pleasure.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to visit petermcgraw.org for more information about our guest, show notes, and social media links. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share with others. Join Dr. Peter McGraw next week for another fun, fascinating conversation on I'm Not Joking.
Yo.